Good afternoon. I'm Jennifer McClendon, Education Manager for Sportsfield Management Association. Welcome to our post-conference virtual education webinar series. Today's speakers are Dr. Quincy Law and Tim VanLoo, CSFM. Dr. Quincy Law is an assistant professor of turfgrass science at Iowa State University. He earned his master's and Ph.D. at Purdue University under the direction of Dr. Aaron Patton. Tim VanLoo, CSFM, is currently employed with Van Wall Equipment and was STMA's 24th president. Tim received his bachelor's and master's at Michigan State University in crop and soil science with an emphasis on turfgrass. Tim worked at Northwestern University and recently served as director of facilities and grounds at Iowa State University. Tim and Dr. Law will be presenting Measuring and Managing Soil Carbon on Sports Fields. Speakers?
Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. And welcome everybody to our post-conference seminar. So again, my name is Quincy Law and my counterpart, Tim VanLoo. Interestingly enough, Tim and I both worked on our master's projects relating to soil carbon. So we kind of have a shared interest in that regard. But Tim kind of brings a great manager's perspective to this, and so I'll kind of start us off and talk a lot about some of the research, and then Tim will kind of pound home the take-home messages there. So first off, can everybody see my slides okay? So to get started here on for an outline, we'll go through some important definitions and kind of delineate some of the different meanings of those words that as they relate to soil carbon. Talk briefly about the turfgrass carbon cycle and how that relates to managing turf in a sports field setting. Talk about some of the benefits and issues relating to carbon, right? So there are some cases that we want to accumulate carbon and others where we want to reduce or manage it. And then talk about the different ways that we measure and then also manage soil carbon. And then we'll leave some time at the end of the seminar for any questions that you may have.
Dr. Law, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
You might want to see your screen's kind of small. I don't know if
Yeah.
there it is. It's maybe start the presentation so we can make it a little bit bigger. It might look different on your end.
Yeah, it does. I'm sorry about that. So I'm not.
We can still see it. It was just a little smaller.
Yeah, when I try to move into theater mode, it like Okay, is this better?
Yeah, we can still see it. It's good.
It must be with your split screen, Quincy.
Yeah, it is.
There you go. Now you got it.
There it is.
All right. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, we'll work through this outline. So as far as the definitions that we'll cover, and we'll work through each of these individually. First, we'll talk about carbon and where the plants obtain that and how that ends up in the soil. How that soil carbon then relates to soil organic matter, right? So there's a fraction of that soil organic matter that is carbon, and we'll kind of talk about that and where it's measured there. And then lastly, delineate what goes into that carbon pool in the soil, right? So that's called total soil carbon, and that's made up of an organic component as well as inorganic soil carbon. And Alec Kowalewski has a great soil core here that kind of shows the original sand-based root zone and then what organic matter does to that root zone, right? So we learn in intro soils that iron and organic matter are kind of the two components that lead to color in soils, and so organic matter has that darker color there. So first, talk about soil carbon or just carbon in general, I should say. And so we sometimes forget that carbon is one of the 17 essential elements for plant growth. And so while we generally focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and other nutrients, carbon is one of those 17 essential elements. The difference, though, is that this is obtained through photosynthesis, right? So the plants take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and with light and water are able to turn that carbon into carbohydrates, and then they release oxygen as well. But it's those carbohydrates in the plant that eventually get deposited into the soil. So soil organic matter is another fraction of the soil, and so where it is important is that as plants grow, they start to deposit organic matter into the soil. And how this relates to soil carbon is that soil organic matter is approximately 50% carbon. And so it depends on the exact turf species of what fraction is percent or percent carbon, but roughly 50% or half of that organic matter is carbon. Soil microbes then decompose that soil organic matter and release CO2 into the atmosphere. But what happens in that process is that soils will accumulate organic matter and thus carbon over time. And so eventually we'll hit an equilibrium, but for about 30 to 50 years, soils will slowly but surely accumulate carbon. As we get into some of these definitions, it's important to note that for a field manager, there's very little functional difference between soil carbon and soil organic matter, right? And so for you all managing turf, these two words are nearly synonymous. However, when you go to measure soil carbon or soil organic matter, that is when it is imperative, right? So that you are consistently testing the same thing in your soil. But largely, we'll use soil carbon and soil organic matter interchangeably here. This picture does a good job describing or showing what organic matter does in the soil. And so as you get more organic matter, you see that you have a darker and darker soil profile there. So in addition to soil organic matter, we also have a couple different forms of soil carbon, right? And so it makes sense that the entire pool or the total pool of carbon is called total soil carbon. And this total soil carbon is made up of both organic and inorganic soil carbon. And so organic is in the sense that it's coming from organic materials or biological materials. And so this will include some forms of labile carbon or biologically active carbon. But this is the carbon that is coming from organic matter, right? And so this is the organic soil carbon pool there. Soil organic matter, again, is about 50% carbon, and this is organic carbon. On the flip side, inorganic soil carbon is another fraction of that total soil carbon equation, and this is largely found in carbonate materials. And so in agricultural settings, inorganic soil carbon is not as important as it is in a turfgrass setting, specifically when we are using calcareous sands, because those calcareous sands include inorganic soil carbon. And so when we think about measuring these different types of soil carbon, it's important to note where they're coming from because it gives you a better idea of exactly what you're measuring there. And the photograph on the right kind of shows what a calcareous sand appears like. So it contains those carbonate materials. So when I was a master's student, like I said, I was working on some soil carbon work. And simply what I want to illustrate here is that in those first few years after planting or establishing a new sports field, you are likely to see a linear increase in soil carbon over time. And so this graph shows different years after planting and a measure of soil carbon, labile soil carbon, and obviously we're seeing a very direct trend as a result of carbon accumulating over time. And so why that happens in the soil is because of that carbon cycle. And so this is a pretty simple illustration of the carbon cycle in a turfgrass system. And so we have two major pools of carbon in this, and we have our CO2 in the atmosphere, and we have that pool of soil carbon in the soil. And as those plants grow and we mow them off and return clippings to the soil, we'll get those organic additions. So again, those additions are coming from both above ground as well as root dieback will contribute that organic matter that eventually becomes soil carbon. It doesn't just necessarily stay there though, right? The plants will respire some carbon, the soil will respire due to some microbes. And so it's a complex system that again starts with photosynthesis and then eventually results in an increase in that soil carbon pool. And
Hey,
so,
Quincy,
yeah,
I have a question for you.
yeah.
So you're really saying the carbon is just, it's either in the air or it's in the ground, right?
In this system, yeah, right. So we're dealing with it in those two, but not just the ground, I guess. It's because it's in the plants themselves, right? So
Right.
the plants are largely constructed of carbon, but again, this carbon pool in the soil is what we're dealing with in terms of managing that organic matter. And so there's a general balancing act between soil carbon accumulation and then removal. And so when we think about measuring carbon, it's generally because we're worried about accumulating too much of it. And so in a sense, soil carbon is related to the biomass production, or in other words, as turfgrass growth increases, we see more organic additions to the soil. And so whatever will increase turfgrass growth will largely increase our soil organic matter. And so that can include the turf grasses that we select, how much nitrogen fertilizer we're applying, whether we return or collect our grass clippings. So there's a number of factors that can increase or increase to a lesser amount the amount of carbon that's being accumulated. And so some research that I did previously that looked at turfgrass growth with the eventual amount of soil carbon that ends up in the soil. And what this experiment looked at was a couple different species of grass. And so we have tall fescue as TF and Kentucky bluegrass as KBG. And we collected grass clippings every week for 2 years. And so you can see the different number of collections over time there. And then just tallied that organic dry matter yield over time. And what we found is that, excuse me there, tall fescue accumulated more dry matter yield than Kentucky bluegrass. Additionally, within those different growth rates, we did see a little bit different dry matter yield. But what we found is that tall fescue accumulated more dry matter yield than Kentucky bluegrass, and it also resulted in more total soil carbon. So on the right, top right here, we have the amount of soil carbon by turfgrass species. And so you can see that tall fescue had more total soil carbon than Kentucky bluegrass, which again relates back to how much dry matter yield they're producing or grass clippings. Conversely, though, as you can imagine, as tall fescue grew faster, it needed to be mowed more often. And so we saw that we had an annual mowing requirement that was higher for tall fescue than Kentucky bluegrass. So that entire balance is delicate, but in general, those practices that increase clipping yield will increase soil carbon. On the flip side, however, soil carbon loss is related to how much is being removed, how much we're diluting that with top dressing, and what the microbial activity is of that soil system. And so practices that remove organic matter include core aerification, different types of scarification or cultivation that are physically removing that organic matter. Top dressing is an important practice because it helps to dilute the organic matter in that sand-based system. And then lastly, factors that increase or decrease microbial activity will also result in more or less losses of soil carbon. And so an important one that I like to remind folks of is irrigation or watering, right? And so we often run into more thatch when we water too much. And part of the reason for that is because that excess water actually reduces microbial activity. And so as a result, we get less microbial breakdown of that soil carbon. And so while it's not just a balancing act for accumulations versus losses, it's also kind of a balance between benefits and issues. And so there are a few benefits of soil carbon, right? So one of these is that it increases capacity of the soil to hold water and nutrients. And so here's a good figure from Mans et al. In 2016 that illustrates that as our soil organic carbon increases, right? So as we get more soil carbon, we also can hold more water in the soil. And this is true across sand, loams, and clay soils as well, right? So you see a nice linear trend there that as soil organic carbon accumulates, we're also seeing a response of a higher soil water content. So that can be beneficial. It's not always beneficial, however. There's some improvements in soil structure as a result of soil carbon. It can drive some microbial activity. Another benefit in terms of climate change is sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, and that's part of why some of this research is being done. And while there hasn't been any carbon credit programs in turfgrass systems, there are carbon credit programs in row crop agriculture that may be a benefit for a sports field manager down the line. However, these benefits can also turn into issues or consequences if we don't manage them closely. And so one of those is thatch. So thatch production is obviously an issue, excess thatch at that. And when we get too much thatch or organic matter at that soil surface, that can start to reduce our infiltration, drainage. Improper layering can also occur, as you can see in both of these pictures on the right, that are dealing with laying a heavy sod roll over existing thatch, or top dressing not frequently enough to dilute that organic matter, which is resulting in the layering in a golf course putting green here. Additionally, though, is that playability and player safety can also be impacted. And so I'll let Tim take over on some of those points there.
All right. So if you can think back to the slide, and maybe Quincy can kind of go back real quick to the ones where you had the same soil but different amounts of organic matter. It was all like kind of laid out, and it kind of started with light to dark. And so if you think about that kind of picture of organic matter, so if you take the far right, that's Iowa soils. It's all black dirt. It's really odd because it drains well and it does a lot of things. And then, yeah, this is the one. So if these are all the same exact soil, as far as, whatever, a sandy loam or whatever it might be, but it's got different amounts of organic matter, that's obviously you can see how it accumulates over time, right? And so that far right, like I said, was kind of like that Iowa soil. It grows amazing corn plants and soybean plants. It holds moisture. We even in a drought year almost have our higher yields because it doesn't affect the wet spots. And then as you go down, so think of the far left as a new construction. When I was selling chemical and fertilizer, we'd have people in lawn care, like they struggled with your new construction sites, right? And a lot of times it was like my antidote would just be, let's just push growth for 3 to 5 years and see where we're at to see if we get a better kind of response. And so you would do that with obviously added nitrogen. You can go back to where we were there. I just kind of want to give it a little bit of an idea of when I start talking about accumulating organic matter, what that really looks like. And I thought that was a really good picture of it. So obviously playability and safety is what the practitioner or the athletic field manager cares most about. And obviously the level of play matters, right? So if you've got, little people out there, less 10 years and less, they're really light, they're really small. They might not need the same traction and playability as a 300-pound lineman on a NFL or college football team. And so that's going to kind of play into this a little bit. And obviously the sports differ, right? I mean, at football, the traction is a premium, where in baseball, it's more ball response and ball roll, just like soccer. And so when you start looking at this as a holistic type thing, what might be right for soccer may not be right for baseball or softball. And so I just want to kind of get that in perspective a little bit. So Quincy talked about a little bit. Organic matter is gonna hold moisture, and when I have a sand-based system, my biggest worry was always the amount of moisture that I'm going to hold, right? Because I didn't want to decrease my rooting depth, because a lot of this organic matter, like to reference back when I did my study for my master's, which I told Quincy we weren't going to include because it was 20 years ago and I didn't want to talk about it that much, but it was that organic matter accumulates in the top down, right? So it's going to accumulate faster in the top inch than it does from 1 to 2 inches and 2 to 4 inches. And so in a sand-based system, if you're not doing the cultural practices you need, you're going to accumulate organic matter on the surface or near the surface, which then creates a wet spot for the roots to be happy and healthy. But as soon as you put large athletes on, it's going to push and not work right. So that moisture does affect the stability and possibly the shearing and peeling that you can see where chunks come up, right? And that's what all of us don't want. And then the thatch, it's funny that Quincy and I, when we were putting this together, Dr. Minner would have been a guy that was at Iowa State for a long time, and he always preached about how much you needed a bunch of thatch at the beginning of the season to help you take wear. And when Quincy came down when he was a student, it was one of those where it's like, I don't have any thatch in my system because I was always aerifying and pulling all that stuff out. And so thatch might be right in certain situations to help maintain wear, especially like when you have a rec type system that has hundreds and hundreds of games. It might help prolong that wear a little bit. But in a sand-based system, I always felt that the cleat needed to get into the sand a little bit to get traction. And so for larger athletes, I should say. So that kind of depends on the system as well and what level you are. So you can go to the next one, Quince. So the other thing to consider here is what system do you have, right? I managed a sand-based root zone very, very different than I did my native soil fields. And I'm going to reference Iowa State quite a bit just because I spent 11 years there, and we had both systems. All right. So we had 3 sand-based systems. We had our softball field, our practice football, and then the stadium. And so those were all sand-based, all USGA type systems. Softball was actually more of a California style, but we don't really need to worry about that too much. Just it was a sand root zone. And then I had some really high-end native fields. We had some what we call two-a-day fields. They were what football used before the season started, kind of through August. And those were down by the river in Ames. And so they were kind of down in this bottom, and they were this sandy loam that was very mature soil. So when you picture that equilibrium type situation where after 40, 50, 60 years of it being there, like that system's pretty self-sufficient in a way. That's what we had. And so we didn't worry about organic matter accumulating as far as we didn't manage it. We managed it in a very different way. So long story short, in a sand-based system, I was far more worried about organic matter accumulation and where it was accumulating at. And so we spent a lot of time top dressing, aerifying, and kind of trying to dilute some of that stuff out. So obviously mowing height's going to play in a factor. Fertility, are you pushing this stuff to grow? That just like what Quincy talked about, if you push it to grow, you're going to accumulate more. Is that good or bad? Do you have to worry about that? And then obviously irrigated, it's all in plant health, right? If it's irrigated, you're going to have more accumulate as well. So, and then kind of that bottom thing there, play versus non-play areas. The middle of our football fields, especially the sand-based system, would accumulate far less over time than the outsides where the system was far healthier. And I think that had a lot to do with just rhizome growth. A lot of the other stuff would get pulled out, and we would mine that after games and blow all that stuff off. And so it was a slightly different situation where we had to monitor that a little bit different. Go ahead, go to the next one, Quincy. So as a practitioner, what does this really matter and why do you care, right? Native soils benefit from it. If you're a farmer here in Iowa, you're all about trying to accumulate organic matter. The more organic matter, the healthier the system you have for the most part. If in a sand-based system, it can cause issues, right? Compaction, or what I would call, like what I was kind of drilled into my head at Michigan State from Dr. Crum, was a loss of macropore space. So organic matter is very small. And so it can fill in the voids that a sand-based system has. So you're reducing your micropore space a little bit. And so therefore you're going to reduce drainage, as it says. And so that is an issue in a sand-based system. As you start to accumulate past 2, 3, 4, 5%, you're going to start to choke that system out, and it's not going to drain like it was originally designed. So like I said, macro pore space. So when we would try to create that drainage or maintain that drainage is a better way, that's where you start to core aerify, mine that core off, refill it back with a fresh sand. And so that organic matter is diluted and mined off, if that makes sense. You would potentially spoon feed the fertility a little bit because you don't have organic matter that holds those nutrients. Because the organic matter is also a really good holder of nutrients and moisture, right? And so you're going to have to water a little bit differently in a low organic matter situation. And you're also going to have to fertilize it a little bit different. So we would utilize a lot of slow release fertilizers. We would make sure we're foliar feeding micronutrients just because we knew that system didn't have it in those sand-based systems. I don't know what else I can say about sand-based systems other than it was a far more of in the forefront of my mind and how I manage that than it was in our native soil type systems. Go to the next one, Quincy. How are we doing on time? So we got about a half hour still. We're good. So recommendations, right? How is this important to you? Where are the depths of it? How do you handle it? The location, what is your soil and how do you analyze it? And that's where like also my research going back to that is how do you best test for this? And do different tests give you different answers or different percentages? And the answer is yes. And so it's going to kind of, just like in a soil test, you got to kind of understand how to read a soil test. You also got to understand how they're doing that test a little bit. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in these slides to come. Go ahead, Quincy. So I think it's important to identify goals. Again, I kind of talked about those soils that were laid out on that tailgate or whatever that was, where, in a new construction type situation, accumulating organic matter, especially in a native soil field. In Iowa, we have these large athletic complexes being built. And a lot of times they strip the topsoil off, they move a lot of dirt around, and then they put as much of the topsoil back on as they can. But when they do that, it messes with all of what was there. And not always is that organic matter or that topsoil put back at in all of it uniformly, right? So there's these areas that all of a sudden you struggle with compaction, you struggle with water infiltration, you struggle with growth and all of these things. Well, if you take a core in there, like a little plug or something, you see that it's really not dark. It's very light in color. Or if you're down south, I don't know who all the people are watching, if you're down south where you get a lot more rain and it's more weathered and the organic matter just isn't there in that soil, then that might be an area where you're trying to increase that as much as possible. And so that's where you can start to talk about, pushing growth and doing certain things. Maybe you're not core aerifying and removing those cores. You're just core aerifying for compaction type stuff, but then you're putting those cores back into the system so that organic matter doesn't go away. Or are you in a system like I talked about, the sand-based system, or even these newer sand-based systems with the fibers that are sewn in, like Jack Trice has now, where you have to mine that organic matter off with like a Phrasmo every year because it accumulates again from the top down. And so if you remove it off the top every year, then you can maintain that soil profile. So you really got to start to figure out like, okay, how is this actually do I have a problem with organic matter, or do I need more? Or is my system right where it needs to be? And then how do I maintain that and keep it right? And so again, even in a sand-based system, when we built our softball field, we didn't add any peat into the mix, right? So it was 100% USGA sand that had essentially zero organic matter. Well, for those first 2 or 3 years, I didn't mind the fact that we were going to accumulate some organic matter. What I wanted to do was stir it into the system and keep it 2 to 3, 4 inches down, not just at the top. So we would core aerify, but then we would drag those in a little bit more often than we were at our football system that had enough organic matter in it. Does that make, I hope that makes sense. So we were trying to get to that 1, 2, or 3% to where you took a core out. It wasn't just looking like a beach of sand. It had a little bit of dark color in it, but then we're also making sure it wasn't layering. And so again, it kind of depends on the situation and what you're trying to accomplish. But, it's one of those where organic matter can be really good for you, or it can be a hindrance or be really bad. So you gotta first figure that out. What else did I miss on this, Quincy? Anything? Depth usually concentrated
Just
surface.
kind of the form of carbon, but kind of already hit on that. Just understanding what they're measuring once you submit that sample. But we've got a couple more slides that detail that a little bit. So once you need to start soil sampling, if you start poking around online, you'll probably find actually a few different methods, and it may be a little confusing about which one to pick, right? So just a couple examples of what is online. There's a Purdue extension publication from Riker and Throssell that recommends sampling to a 3-inch depth, and they suggest to remove thatch and live plant material, right? So specific, that's what their specific recommendations are. Currently, the Rutgers Soil Testing Lab recommends a minimum of a 4-inch depth, and they say that you can remove it. They don't necessarily recommend to, but they say you can remove that thatch and live plant material. This picture on the bottom right comes from Ohio State University Extension, where they are recommending to, again, reject that organic layer when you submit this sample for analysis. Conversely, Dr. Micah Woods has been promoting the OM246 methodology, which is sampling to a 6-centimeter depth and partitioning that into 3 subsamples: 0 to 2, 2 to 4, and 4 to 6 centimeters. And then the recommendation there is to leave the thatch and live plant material. And they actually take it a step further and do not grind or sieve those samples once it's submitted at the proper lab for that OM246 sample. And so it can be very confusing for a practitioner, even when they look at what the experts are recommending, that, there's some conflicting information out there. And so we're not here to necessarily recommend one method over another. Instead, we are trying to inform you of these different sampling and analysis methods, and are trying to promote the fact or idea that you stay consistent, right? And if you keep changing that test, it's very difficult to understand where you're actually at, right? You're hitting a moving target if you keep rotating through different sampling procedures. And so previously we said that you need to stay consistent, and that's what we're going to kind of keep hammering, that you sample to a consistent depth. You decide if you're going to leave that thatch and organic matter, or if you're going to remove it, and stay consistent with that year over year. Right. And so not only how you sample will impact the results, but also what tests you actually submit it for. And so we talked through these different types or forms of carbon in the soil. And so this is trying to explain, well, how is that soil carbon analyzed? And so if you submit a sample for analysis for soil organic matter specifically, it'll likely go through something that is loss on ignition. So the samples will be dried down. And so this is an example of the OM246 model from Dr. Woods that illustrates that they will take a oven dried sample and weigh how much the soil and organic matter weighs. They'll run that through a muffle furnace at 360 degrees centigrade, which is a very hot furnace, and it'll simply burn off all of the organic matter there. And so they'll just weigh it before and after they put it in that muffle furnace, and that loss on ignition is simply what that measurement is. And so your organic matter, again, it's what will burn off in that muffle furnace. In contrast, total soil carbon, it's through combustion in a very specialized machine. So they put a very small amount of soil into a tin foil ball, and it will combust that, and they'll collect the amount of CO2 that comes off and give you the amount of total soil carbon. And so this is probably the second most common of these carbon tests, is this total soil carbon. And again, that total soil carbon includes organic as well as inorganic soil carbon. There is a little bit of organic soil carbon testing that you can get. It's generally more university labs, right? So these last 2 points of how soil carbon is analyzed are more research methods than commercial laboratories. And so that organic soil carbon is the acid treatment or Walkley-Black method. Again, it uses acid to determine how much organic soil carbon is there. And then another test can be done for inorganic soil carbon, but again, it's at that university or research level and less so a commercially available lab.
Hey,
And
Quincy,
so,
let me touch on those three real quick.
yep.
So, for the sake of everybody here, like, so when I did my master's thesis, I did those first three in all comparison. And so, not that you should ever go back and look at that, but what I would tell you is they are very different percentage wise. And so, like, you can get, like, let's call it statistical difference if you analyze the same sample with all three of those when you compared it. But when you compared the same method over years, then you could start to see a very easy trend. So the biggest thing is to stay with one. Now, it's most likely that wherever you send it, it's going to do a loss on ignition. Most likely. You just want to make sure, because if all of a sudden you did a loss on ignition one year and then a combustion type the next, those percentages will be very different, even though it should be very similar, if that makes sense. So like Quincy said, I just want to reiterate, make sure you know what you're signing up for and make sure that it's consistent.
Yeah, less about telling your athletes that, hey, we analyzed it this manner, and instead that we are monitoring it in a consistent method, right? And so, how do you select a soil test? I think more so about, what lab are you currently working with? Do you have a consultant? But just understand that when you select for a soil test, that when we measure soil organic matter, again, which is soil organic matter is about 50% carbon. So when we analyze for soil organic matter, we are not specifically testing for soil carbon, but we can get a very good estimate from that organic matter reading of how much soil carbon is there, roughly 50%. Note that if you select a total soil carbon test, that is also going to include inorganic carbon, right? And so again, if we refresh of what that inorganic carbon means, well, that could represent calcareous sand top dressing. And so if you are using a calcareous sand for your top dressing program, or it was a calcareous sand in your original sand-based root zone mix, understand that there is carbon associated with that is not part of that organic matter. And so if you select a total soil carbon test, that just know that calcareous sand may have an impact there. Organic and inorganic soil carbon are not routine tests, so you may read about them in the literature, but it may be more difficult to find them in a commercially available lab. And then my last point here is a quite an important one, because if you look back on one of your routine soil fertility tests that you may have submitted, you may notice that organic matter is listed on that test. Sometimes that test is measured. Other times on your soil test report, they are just giving you an estimated amount of soil organic matter. And so just be sure that when you submit that routine soil fertility test, if it has an organic matter number on there, understand that it may be one or the other, and know what you're actually testing for. Because again, you're paying for that service. It's good to know exactly what you're receiving there. And so if you go to interpret a soil test, understand and know that one soil test is simply a snapshot in time. Right. And so we're not necessarily managing for a specific number of or amount of soil carbon, but what we are looking at is that change over time. right? Are we moving in the direction that we want? And are we getting the playability that we're searching for? Um, when you begin a soil testing program for your soil carbon or organic matter, again, consistency is key. Sampling to the same depth every year, sampling from that same field. Sampling at the same time of year is also important, right? You may get different numbers in the spring, summer, and fall, and so there's maybe not an ideal time to sample between those, but just be consistent year over year of when you're sampling that. And again, same field, same depth, and then submit them for the same analysis, right? That way we can graph that over time and figure out really what's happening on that field instead of just trying to hit a moving target. Another important aspect of a soil test is your units. So it depends on where or how your test is being analyzed, but just understand that percent parts per million might be pounds per acre that you receive units in, but they are all very different in the amount there, right? And it also gets back to the analysis. What form of carbon is being tested there? Uh, Also, same point from the last slide, but again, if you are interpreting a soil test, understand if that is the measured amount of soil carbon there, or if they are estimating that amount of soil organic matter based on something else in that test. And then, you know, fast forward 3 years, and you've got a few years of experience in soil tests that are plotting your organic carbon or organic matter over time. That's when you'll start to get a good feedback on your cultivation and top dressing programs. And I think it's about that time period that you'll start to understand what those numbers mean, right? And that's what this TDR analogy is that these are just going to be numbers to start with. But as you start to correlate your TDR readings with the amount of soil organic matter, or the amount of slipping that's occurring on your field, or the amount of shearing and tearing with the amount of organic matter, right? As you build that kind of full data set over time and get a better picture of what those numbers mean, then you'll get a better idea of how to respond in terms of cultivation and top dressing, right? So is that number that you have ideal, right? Should you be maintaining that number, or should you be working to increase or decrease it, right? And part of that's going to take some time, right? Just like when you implemented a TDR onto your sports field facility, that at first it was just a number, and then as you went through time, you started to figure out what that number meant and what it meant to you, and that a 15 at your facility may not be a 15 at the neighboring one. I got another slide here just to try to illustrate the amount of carbon that we're talking about when you get a soil test report back. And so this is a figure from Micah Woods that illustrates the amount of soil organic matter as a percent in the top 10 centimeters, which is about 4 inches of the root zone, right? So across the bottom axis here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5% organic matter. And then on the y-axis, or the response there, is the amount of carbon or pounds of carbon per 1,000 square feet in that top 4 inches. And so what you can see is that a 1% increase in soil organic matter can be over 100 pounds of carbon per 1,000 square feet, right? And so when you see just a change of 0.1% or 0.5%, that is a significant amount of carbon in that system. So it's kind of a twofold point there that that for each of those increases, it takes a lot of growth to increase soil carbon. But two, once you start to accumulate that, it can be a significant reduction required to hit that number that you're after. And so just a different way to picture what that soil test report is displaying. And so got about 10 or 15 minutes to wrap up here. And so Tim's going to kind of hit on some of the different management philosophies here of enhancing soil organic matter, maintaining what you have, or significantly decreasing the amount of organic matter.
Yeah, I've talked about it a little bit, and so I mean, some of this will just be kind of just a reiteration of kind of what we talked about. And you know, to go back one slide, actually, go back one slide, Quincy. When he showed me this slide, I was like, okay, so a percent's like 100 to 150 pounds of carbon, so it's like 3 bags of fertilizer, right? To give myself like this visual understanding of what are we actually talking about as far as carbon. And that doesn't seem like a lot when you're talking a 4-inch depth, but it's just it's something that you can like think about and hold on to. Like, okay, we're actually pulling stuff out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground that can be weighed. And so when you start doing this in a really scientific way, like I don't want to lose focus that this is like real things that are actually happening all the time as things photosynthesize and as you grow grass and do things. So just as a visual, what does 100 pounds mean? It's like, well, you got 2 bags of something, right? 250-pound bags of carbon now had accumulated just through nature and what you've been doing. So, okay, now you can go to the next one. So basically, like you said, you really kind of have a couple different options here as a manager, right? Are we trying to enhance it? Are we trying to get more of it? Are we trying to maintain what we have, or are we trying to decrease it? And that's only there's only you that can answer that question, or somebody that you might ask to come look at your stuff. But really, you kind of gotta figure out what your goals are. What are your problem areas, and is organic matter a lack thereof or an excess of causing an issue, right? And so, just some quick potential things like to enhance, native soils, especially new construction. I talked about that. I mean, around here, especially around homes, like it's one of the most common lawn care issues around our area specifically is these new subdivisions. It's like they just strip all the topsoil off and they sell that away, and then they leave you with this barren wasteland called soil that just doesn't work well for growing grass. And then usually they slap on some sod on top and they expect it to grow, right? And it just is a constant battle until you can get that soil to work for you, which typically means you've increased your organic matter in that system, right? And then you got to maintain it. Or if you're in a system where you're maintaining, in a let's say a 4 to 5 year maybe sand-based system that's got 2 to 3% organic matter in it, that's probably a pretty good happy space. Quincy might have a different opinion on that, but somewhere in there is usually where I try to keep our fields. I felt I was comfortable with that. It would hold a little bit of nutrients, hold a little bit of water, but none of that in excess. And so I could still manage it in a way that worked for us. And then am I trying to decrease it? One of the worst things that I've walked onto is when you get asked to look at a field, a sand-based system especially, and you walk out there and the top 2 inches are looking like just black magical dirt, and then underneath it looks like you just walked on the beach at Daytona. And you're like, this is the problem, right? Because all of those roots are going to sit up top. Nothing's going to go past that. There's going to be a lot of nutrient holding capacity. Everything's going to sit atop. So the roots, you can basically just grab that system and peel it up. And so there you'd be wanting to decrease the organic matter as quickly and as fast as possible, right? So once you establish those philosophies, then we can start talking about, as this next slide, we'll talk about enhancing a little bit more, kind of what you can do. Like I talked about in a new construction, especially, you're going to push that grass, you're going to push the fertility, make sure it has some micronutrients, make sure it has all of the things it needs to grow healthy. Cultivar selection or species and cultivar selection, like Quincy talked about, tall fescue grows faster, and on the flip side of that, also increases organic matter faster. And so if you're in a system where you just need to like create better soil quickly, then maybe figuring out what kind of grass you want might be part of that equation. And then there's cultivar selection, like some of these bluegrasses that are really aggressive, especially some of what I would call the top of the pyramid, the super elites, as they say, that are really aggressive, both rhizomatous and for their top growth for recovery. I mean, those in my mind, are going to accumulate organic matter a lot faster than maybe like what a shamrock type bluegrass would be, which is kind of towards the bottom of the bluegrass pyramid. That's more of an upright growth, doesn't have a lot of rhizomatous activity. My guess is if I was going to extrapolate out what I think about the plants and how they're growing, I would think that that's going to accumulate slower, right? And so that might be part of the equation here is that selection. And then, pest management, all of those things are going to play into a role. And then are you top dressing with organic matter? So that's when you get into the scariest thing for me to ever like tell somebody is, yeah, you should put compost on your system, because that is such a loaded question on where is that coming from? What is it? Is it hot? Is it going to cause more issues? But there are situations where you can potentially on the top. A lot of times you'll aerify first, maybe open it up, and then you can start to incorporate some of that organic matter in more of a physical, straightforward way with a top dressing. You might think about reducing sand top dressing in those situations, at least for a little while until you get some, in a sand-based system for sure, until you get enough of it in there where the system's a little healthier and a little bit less volatile with fertility and water. And then again, you can return the cores. Like I gave my example when we grew in our softball field, it was a 4-inch sand cap essentially on top of some drainage, and it was very barren sand. And so those first couple summers we pushed hard and we didn't really remove the cores. We just stirred them around. And so I was trying to get organic matter into the system, but I didn't want it to all accumulate at the top. And so then you just start to game plan on how best can we do that and what equipment can do that for us. And so that's potentially some examples for enhancing soil organic matter. Next is maintaining it, right? It's one of those where this, to me, in my mind, it's that sand-based system or a native system that's very healthy. Everything's growing is pretty easy. You're not getting any weird hot spots. Fertility seems to work really well. It responds well to a fertilizer type situation. And play and rooting is good, right? And so then you're just trying to maintain it. And it's good at it. This is where you want to know where you're at. And so you can see if you're starting to decrease or increase that organic matter, so you can kind of stay in that window of what you've deemed to be right in your situation. And so it may be playing with that fertility. It might be playing with that top dressing program, but trying to figure out how you can keep it where it's at and making sure it doesn't accumulate on the top, and that the system stays healthy. And then you've got basically to decrease it. And this is where there's lots of options for this. There's a whole array of machines that can help you with this. As far as core cultivation, this is the thing that if in the situation I talked about where you've got 2 inches in a sand-based system that's really loaded with organic matter and then a bunch of sand on the bottom, does a deep tine actually help you in this situation, or should we be using about a 3 or 4 inch tine to get as much of that out as we can and then top dress back into that system? And so, all of these cultivation tools have a purpose. They have a spot. Make sure you're using the right one in that situation. But cultivation is the easiest one. And then you've got, as far as, things like the phrase mowing option, as far as taking it off the very top is, if it's in especially with the new fibers, and we're going to learn a whole lot more about this fiber system. It's been in the States for, I don't know, going on about 25 years now. I know we were looking at it in 2000 when I was in undergrad at Michigan State, and it's only gotten better, the tools to manage those things. And then FIFA is going to explode it even more with the having to play all their competitions on that type of system. So we're going to know a whole lot more. My guess is in the next couple of years at SFMA conference, we're going to have the opportunity to see a lot of that stuff in action and see what works, what doesn't. To take off that organic matter or remove it, those are options that you can utilize. And then obviously you can then you can top dress into that to dilute it, right? It's all percentages here, right? If you add a bunch of sand into that system, then you're decreasing by volume that organic matter potentially. Now, when you do that over time, just be wary that in especially in a sand-based system, if you're consistently sand top dressing, or even in a native system where you're consistently top dressing, that field does get bigger, right? Like it grows. When we renovated Jack Trice a couple years ago, right after I left, they removed almost 8 to 10 inches of material out of that system. Now it had been there almost 25 years. So over that time, the amount of tonnage of top dressing that we put in, the organic matter that got added to that, again, 100 pounds every percent, right? So if you factor that out over acres, you're growing the soil essentially. I laugh at, like, I live in a neighborhood that, my yard's been around for about 50 years. And a couple years ago, I got to redo it. And mostly why I wanted to redo it is because my sidewalk was about 2 or 3 inches below the surface of the soil. And some might say the concrete sank. The reality is that the soil grew over time, right? There's organic matter, there's other dust and all the other stuff that compounded, but over 50 years of time, that system grew. And it's been a carbon deposit for many, many years. And so to kind of scrape that all back and reuse it to level off some of the back made sense to me. So we redid it. But that's the kind of stuff that happens in a very healthy system and over time. So, if you got to decrease it, then you got to use some of those tools to get there. And then obviously you don't want to push, crazy growth or those kind of things. And then you can utilize some PGRs either for or against some of that stuff too. So Quincy went to the slide that I wanted him to. If you guys have any questions, I don't know how this works. I'm pretty confident you can send us something. I don't know if there's any ability to do that. Oh, there looks like there's one in there maybe. Oh, you're just spelling the wrong. Oh, no, you're good. So yeah, so I don't know how to end this, Quincy. This is really weird in this kind of system, but
yeah, if there's anybody that just has a question, you can either send us both an email or send it in the chat, and we'll get to it in the next couple of minutes here. We've got a couple more before the seminar's done yet, but yeah, if you have any, put them into the Q&A now.
If not, we're going to assume that we nailed it and every question has been answered.
And, it'd be nice if we were in person, we could talk a little more about, what are you testing for at your own facilities, right? Is this an area that you're currently testing for, or is this something that you're considering and want to think more about? Part of what you do every day is managing that organic matter, right? Whether you're supporting growth or trying to remove excess matter, there's something that you're always doing on a sports field to manage that. So.
Great presentation.
Well, I don't see any questions, so I think we're good, right?
Yeah, last call for questions. Doesn't look like we have any. Well, thank you to our speakers and thank you for your attendance in our session today. Just a reminder, this will be available in our educational library, which is free for conference attendees and available for purchase as well. And that information will be going out in a few weeks to the membership. Appreciate everyone's time today and hope everybody has a great day.
See y'all. Thank you.